The Algarve coast of Portugal represents a specific kind of promise to the international traveler. It is designed to be a paradise of leisure, a place where the sun bleaches out the complexities of modern life, leaving only the essentials of relaxation and comfort. In the spring of 2007, the Ocean Club in Praia da Luz was the physical embodiment of this promise. It was not merely a holiday resort. It was a curated environment, a gated bubble where professional families from Northern Europe could simulate a perfect life. But as any investigator who has studied the sociology of crime will tell you, safety is often just an illusion created by architecture and affluence. It was here, inside this perimeter of manicured gardens and whitewashed walls, that the world witnessed the beginning of a modern mystery. This was not just a disappearance. It was an event that would expose the fragile machinery of global empathy. To understand the magnitude of what occurred, we must first look at the setting not as a crime scene, but as a social stage. The Ocean Club was marketed to a specific demographic: doctors, lawyers, and professionals who believed that their status offered them a layer of protection against the chaos of the outside world. This belief is what criminologists often refer to as the hierarchy of vulnerability. At the top of this hierarchy are the faces we are conditioned to care about. The photogenic, the affluent, the protected. The family at the center of this story fit this profile perfectly. They were not merely tourists. They were symbols of a successful, orderly existence. This context is crucial because it explains why the subsequent events did not just remain a local police matter, but mutated into a global obsession. When tragedy strikes the seemingly untouchable, it shatters the public's sense of order. Your attention is the only force capable of breaking this silence. Your support helps us give a voice to those the system has forgotten. Please like and subscribe to ensure these investigations continue to reach the light. Stay with us, because what we are about to uncover goes far beyond a single headline. It exposes a reality you may not be ready to believe. The evening of the 3rd of May began with the rhythmic predictability of a holiday. The parents, a group of educated friends who would later become known in the press as the Tapas 7, were dining at a restaurant just meters away from their apartments. In their minds, they were responsible adults, enjoying a well-earned break. They had established a system, a rotational schedule to check on their sleeping family members. They did not view the apartment as a risk. They viewed it as a secure location, an extension of their own safety. However, from a security perspective, the layout presented a different reality. The apartment, situated on the ground floor with access from the street, was porous. While the parents saw a short walk across a pool area, a security consultant would see a timeline of opportunity. It is this dissonance, the gap between the perceived safety of a resort and the actual vulnerability of a ground floor unit that allowed the incident to occur. The atmosphere that night was calm. The air was cool, the resort was quiet, and the routine of the checks seemed to be functioning without error. But at approximately 10 o'clock in the evening, the routine was broken. One of the mothers returned to the apartment to conduct her visual check. What she found, or rather, what she failed to find, would trigger one of the most expensive and extensive investigations in history. The door was open. The window was raised, and the bed, where her eldest daughter had been resting, was empty. There was no scream, no sound of struggle, only the heavy silence of a room that had lost its focal point. In the immediate aftermath, the reaction was one of confusion rather than forensic precision. This is a critical point of analysis. In a standard urban environment, a disappearance triggers a specific police protocol. But in a holiday resort, the initial response is often filtered through the lens of hospitality. Staff members and guests began a frantic search, calling out the name of the missing individual, unknowingly trampling over potential evidence. The timeline of these first few hours is blurred by panic. From a news reporting standpoint, this chaos is the enemy of truth. The scene was not preserved. It was contaminated by the very people trying to help. This tragedy highlights a systemic flaw in how we handle crises in leisure environments. The assumption is always that the individual has wandered off, not that they have been taken. We must also pause to analyze the immediate narrative that began to form. Almost instantly, the focus was not just on the fact that a daughter was missing, but on the who and the where. The concept of the vanishing suggests a sudden, inexplicable removal from existence. However, individuals do not simply vanish. They are moved, taken, or concealed. The language used in those early hours set the tone for the next 2 decades. The parents were initially viewed with profound sympathy, a couple facing every parent's worst nightmare. But as the hours turned into days, and the days into weeks without a resolution, that sympathy began to curdle into something more complex. The public began to ask questions about the decision to leave the sleeping family members alone. This scrutiny is part of the moral wall that surrounds this case. We, as a society, struggle to reconcile our compassion for the loss with our judgment of the circumstances. Why did this specific case capture the world's attention when so many others fade into obscurity? Sociologists argue that it was a perfect storm of elements. The location was familiar to millions of British tourists. The family was relatable to the middle class. And the missing daughter was, in the eyes of the media, the perfect victim, a phrase that sounds cold but reflects the reality of newsroom economics. She was visually striking, her image resonating with a universal idea of innocence. This is where the industry of empathy began to churn. The tragedy was commodified almost immediately. It was not just a news story. It was a serialized drama that the world could participate in. The hierarchy of vulnerability ensured that this investigation would receive resources and attention that a similar incident in a council estate or a refugee camp would never command. It is also necessary to discuss the concept of dehumanization in the context of the investigation, a principle often used to maintain objectivity. To the detectives arriving on the scene, the missing daughter was a subject in a timeline. They had to strip away the emotion to see the facts: a window, a shutter, a gate, a street. But the media did the opposite. They hyperhumanized the story, filling the void of evidence with emotional speculation. This clash between the forensic coldness required to solve a case and the emotional heat required to sell a story created a distortion field. The truth became harder to see because the glare of the flashbulbs was blinding. As the sun rose over Praia da Luz the next morning, the resort had transformed. It was no longer a sanctuary of leisure. It was an open-air examination room. The yellow tape of the police cordon shattered the aesthetic of the paradise. The tennis courts and swimming pools, once symbols of relaxation, now served as the backdrop for a grim procedural. The secure location had been breached, and with it, the illusion that money can buy safety. The disappearance of one individual exposed the vulnerability of everyone. It forced the world to look at the dark spaces between the streetlights, the unmonitored exits, and the fragile trust we place in a lock on a door. We see the birth of the suspicion that would haunt the parents. We see the inadequacy of a local police force overwhelmed by international pressure. And most importantly, we see the beginning of the narrative, the story that would eventually detach itself from reality and become a legend of its own. The tragedy of the disappearance was absolute, but the tragedy of the investigation was just beginning. The timeline of that night remains the most scrutinized few hours in criminal history. Yet it is full of shadows, and it is in those shadows, between the last check and the first alarm, that the truth resides silent, unseen, and waiting. As we move forward, we must adopt a forensic mindset. We must look past the emotional branding and the media circus. We must treat the individuals involved not as characters in a drama, but as subjects in a complex web of evidence and opportunity. The architecture of this vanishing was not accidental. It was a collision of circumstances, geography, and human error. And at the center of it all is a single, undeniable fact. A life was removed from a room, and the world has never stopped looking for the way back. The transition from a holiday atmosphere to a crime scene is rarely instantaneous. It is a gradual, confusing fracturing of reality. At the Ocean Club that night, the shift began not with sirens, but with a singular moment of realization that rippled outward from the ground-floor apartment. When the alarm was raised, it did not immediately register as a criminal event. In the psychology of leisure, the mind rejects the possibility of danger. The initial assumption among the staff and the group of friends was one of benign absence, a family member who had perhaps wandered off, confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. This assumption is critical to understanding the loss of forensic opportunities in those first crucial hours. The window of time known in policing as the golden hour, the period immediately following an incident where evidence is fresh and witnesses are reliable, was not utilized for preservation. Instead, it was spent in a chaotic, desperate search that unknowingly compromised the very location that held the answers. As news of the disappearance spread through the complex, a mobilize and search mentality took hold. This reaction, while born of genuine human compassion, was catastrophic for the investigation. Dozens of well-meaning individuals, staff, guests, and the parents themselves began to comb the area. They walked through the apartment, touched surfaces, and opened doors, effectively layering their own biological traces over those of any potential intruder. From a modern forensic perspective, the crime scene was not secured. It was trampled. The timeline of the police response further complicated the situation. The local law enforcement, the GNR, arrived first. These were officers accustomed to dealing with minor disputes and traffic violations, not complex international disappearances. Their initial assessment was heavily influenced by the statistics of the region, which suggested that missing individuals are almost always found safe within a short distance. They did not immediately seal the apartment or close the borders. They treated it as a missing person case, not a crime scene. It was here that the first major cultural and procedural friction occurred. The parents and their friends, accustomed to the British model of policing, which emphasizes rapid, highly visible intervention and immediate media appeals, were baffled by the Portuguese approach. The local judicial police, the PJ, operate under a system that prioritizes secrecy and procedural caution. To the British group, this caution looked like incompetence. To the Portuguese officers, the group's frantic demands looked like interference. This clash was not merely a language barrier, it was a collision of two entirely different legal philosophies. The British demanded action. The Portuguese demanded protocol. In this gap of understanding, trust began to erode before the investigation had even truly begun. We must also analyze the physical scope of the search that night. While the resort was being scoured, the roads leading out of Praia da Luz remained open. The village is a web of small streets leading to main highways that connect easily to the Spanish border. A vehicle could have traveled a significant distance before any roadblocks were established. The concept of a secure location was exposed as a fallacy. The resort had no CCTV cameras covering the apartment entrances, and the perimeter was easily permeable. The night schedule of the town meant that the streets were largely empty, providing the perfect cover for a quiet extraction. The narrative that emerged in those early hours was one of the vanishing. The media and the public latched onto the idea of a mysterious disappearance, but seasoned investigators know that individuals are not simply erased, they are taken. The failure to treat the apartment as a potential site of a serious crime, what we might call the incident, meant that vital clues were likely lost. Fingerprints may have been smudged, scents confused. The frantic goodwill of the searchers destroyed the silence that forensic science requires to speak. As dawn broke, the reality of the situation set in. The Ocean Club was no longer a holiday destination. It was a containment zone. The parents were thrust into a nightmare that was compounded by their isolation in a foreign legal system. They were not yet suspects, but they were already outsiders. The local community, initially sympathetic, began to feel the strain of the intrusion. The quiet village was waking up to the realization that it was now the center of a dark, unfolding story. The immediate response had failed to secure the individual, but it had succeeded in setting the stage for a conflict that would span decades. The failure was not malicious. It was a failure of imagination. No one wanted to believe that a stranger or an intruder could breach the sanctity of a family holiday. And because they did not believe it could happen, they were not ready when it did. If the first 12 hours were defined by chaos, the subsequent days were defined by the arrival of the industry of empathy. Within 24 hours of the alarm being raised, the satellite trucks began to arrive. They parked on the cobbled streets, erecting masts that beamed the image of Praia da Luz to living rooms around the world. This was the moment the missing daughter ceased to be a private individual and began her transformation into a public icon. The media requires a face to anchor a tragedy, and in this case, they found an image that was hauntingly perfect for consumption. The photographs released by the family, the blonde hair, the direct gaze, and the distinctive mark in the right eye, became the logo of the investigation. We must critically examine how this imagery was used. The media operates on an economy of attention. A missing individual is a tragedy. A missing photogenic individual from an affluent background is a global event. This phenomenon is often discussed by sociologists as the missing white woman syndrome, though in this case it applied to a much more vulnerable subject. The coverage was disproportionate. While hundreds of other families waited for news of their own missing loved ones with little to no press interest, this specific case dominated the headlines. The hierarchy of vulnerability was on full display. The world was told that this life mattered more, that this search required the collective emotional investment of millions. The parents, desperate to keep the search alive, utilized this media hunger. They understood, perhaps instinctively, that silence was the enemy. If the world stopped looking, the police might stop searching. They engaged public relations experts to manage the narrative. The campaign became a brand. Wristbands were sold. Posters were printed in dozens of languages. Celebrities made public appeals. But this strategy, while effective in raising awareness, had a double-edged effect. It turned the investigation into a spectacle. The public was invited to participate, to speculate, and to judge. The line between being a concerned citizen and a consumer of tragedy began to blur. The image of the daughter was everywhere. She was on the front pages of tabloids, on billboards at football matches, and on the news tickers of 24-hour channels. This saturation had a psychological effect on the audience. The public began to feel a sense of ownership over the case. They were not just observers. They felt they were part of the story. This is dangerous ground for any investigation. When the public feels they know the victim, they demand a resolution that fits their emotional investment. They want a simple story of good versus evil. They want a stranger to be caught and punished. They are less willing to accept the messy, ambiguous reality of forensic stalemates, or the possibility that the answer might be uncomfortably complex. As the media coverage intensified, so did the scrutiny. The initial wave of universal sympathy began to recede, replaced by questions about the night schedule and the decision to dine away from the apartment. The public, now feeling entitled to an opinion because they had bought into the brand, began to dissect the family's choices. The industry of empathy is fickle. It sells compassion one day and suspicion the next, depending on which narrative generates more engagement. The capitalization on the tragedy was not limited to the news media. It became a topic for daytime talk shows, online forums, and eventually, true crime entertainment. The incident was repackaged as a mystery to be solved by armchair detectives. The tragedy was dehumanized in a subtle way, not by making the victim an object, but by making her a plot point. The daughter became a ghost in the machine of modern media, her face frozen in time, while the world argued over her fate. The distinctive mark in her eyes a prime example of this commodification. It was a medical detail, a coloboma, but the media turned it into a marketing hook. It was something for people to look for, a reason to stare at the posters. It made the face memorable. Marketing experts would call it brand recognition. It feels cold to use such terms in the context of a tragic loss. But we cannot ignore the reality. The search for the missing daughter became the most heavily marketed missing person campaign in human history. And yet, despite the millions of pounds raised, the millions of posters distributed, and the billions of eyes watching, the result was silence. This disconnect between the volume of noise generated by the media and the lack of tangible progress by the police created a vacuum. And in that vacuum, conspiracy theories began to grow. If the most famous missing person in the world could not be found, the public reasoned, then something must be being hidden. The sheer visibility of the campaign made the lack of a resolution feel impossible to accept. The media had promised a story with an ending, and when reality failed to provide one, the audience began to write their own. The global icon remained frozen on the posters, forever waiting, while the world around her moved from hope to cynicism. The industry that had been built to find her had, in many ways, obscured her. She was no longer just a missing daughter. She was a headline, a debate, and a mirror reflecting the world's obsession with tragedy. In the immediate vacuum created by the lack of physical evidence, a dangerous psychological phenomenon began to take hold of the investigation. The public, the press, and the political establishment could not tolerate the ambiguity of an unsolved mystery. They required a focal point for their outrage. In criminal justice theory, this is the moment where the demand for a villain supersedes the demand for truth. The police, under immense pressure to show progress to the international media, needed a face to attach to the tragedy. This necessity gave birth to the first act of what analysts call the suspect shuffle, the rapid identification of a convenient target to satisfy the collective hunger for a resolution. Enter a local resident, let's call him the first suspect, who lived within walking distance of the Ocean Club. He was not a criminal mastermind. He was simply a man who did not fit the aesthetic of the resort. He lived with his mother, had an eccentric lifestyle, and drifted on the margins of the expat community. In the narrative construction of a crime, he was the perfect archetype of the outsider. The police brought him in for questioning, not because of a forensic link. There was no DNA placing him in the apartment, but because he fit a profile. He was arguably the first victim of the suspect substitution dynamic. The media descended upon his home, dissecting his life, his computer habits, and his personality. For days, the world was encouraged to believe that the predator had been caught. However, this rush to judgment revealed a systemic flaw in the investigation. The focus on Robert M. was driven by proximity and oddity, not by evidence. It was a classic example of confirmation bias. The authorities looked for facts to fit their theory, rather than shaping their theory around the facts. When the searches of his property yielded nothing, no biological traces, no clothing, no sign of the missing daughter, the narrative collapsed. But the damage was already done. The investigation had lost valuable time pursuing a dead end, driven by the media's need for a headline. We must analyze this through the lens of the empathy industry. The public wants to believe that monsters look like monsters. It is comforting to think that danger is recognizable, that it lives in the strange house down the lane. It is far more terrifying to accept that a taker could be someone who blends in, or that the disappearance was a sophisticated act by a stranger who left no trace. By focusing on Robert M., the system provided a temporary sedative to the public's anxiety. It allowed everyone to feel that the police were closing in. But when he was eventually cleared, the anxiety returned with greater intensity, and the spotlight began to swing wildly, searching for a new target. When the pressure is high enough, suspicion becomes a substitute for proof. A man's reputation was dismantled not because he was guilty, but because the story needed a villain. The silence in the apartment remained unexplained, but the noise outside it was deafening. The investigation had stalled, and in its desperation to restart, It was about to make a shocking pivot, turning its gaze from the stranger outside to the family inside. As the summer waned and the leads regarding a local intruder evaporated, the investigation underwent a seismic shift. The Portuguese authorities, frustrated by the lack of progress and feeling the heat of British criticism, began to look inward. This marks the most controversial phase of the case, the moment the parents were designated as arguidos, or formal suspects. This transition was not merely procedural. It was a reversal of the entire global narrative. The icons of grief were suddenly reframed as potential architects of a cover-up. The catalyst for this shift was the arrival of specialist sniffer dogs from the United Kingdom. These animals were trained to detect specific biological markers invisible to the human eye. When the dogs alerted in the apartment, and crucially, near the family's rental vehicle, the police theory transformed. The narrative moved from the vanishing to the incident. The hypothesis presented by the investigators was dark and difficult for the public to digest. It suggested that there had been no abduction. Instead, the theory proposed that the individual had suffered a fatal accident, perhaps an adverse reaction to medication, and that the parents, in a moment of panic, had concealed the tragedy to protect their reputations and careers. We must approach this theory with extreme caution and neutrality. There was no body, no weapon, and the DNA evidence claimed by the police was later described as inconclusive and mixed. However, the mere suggestion of this accident theory shattered the moral wall. Society operates on the presumption of parental instinct, the belief that a parent's only drive is to protect their child. To suggest otherwise is to challenge a fundamental taboo. The media reaction was schizophrenic. The same outlets that had sanctified the parents weeks earlier now began to dissect their every expression for signs of guilt. This is where grief management became a liability. The parents' controlled emotion, their stoicism, and their media savviness traits that had helped build the global campaign were now interpreted as coldness or calculation. If they didn't cry enough, they were unfeeling. If they cried too much, they were performing. They were trapped in a theater of evidence, where their behavior was judged more harshly than the forensic facts. The sedative angle is particularly significant in our analysis of the empathy industry. It humanized the potential crime in a way that made it debatably more horrific. It wasn't the work of a monster. It was, theoretically, a mistake made by exhausted parents trying to manage a night schedule. This possibility divided the public into two fierce camps: those who viewed the parents as victims of a corrupt police force, and those who believed they were manipulating the world's sympathy. The designation of arguido did not lead to charges. The evidence was insufficient to prosecute, but it was enough to destroy the presumption of innocence in the court of public opinion. The parents eventually returned to their home country, but they left behind a fractured investigation. The trust between the family and the local police was irretrievably broken. The incident remained unresolved, suspended between two contradictory stories: a stranger who came in through the window, or a tragedy that never left the room. By the time the first anniversary of the disappearance arrived, the investigation had become a bureaucratic battlefield. The case of the missing daughter was no longer just a police inquiry. It was a diplomatic incident involving three distinct nations: Portugal, the United Kingdom, and eventually Germany. The primary conflict was between the Portuguese judicial police and the British authorities. From the outset, there was a cultural and operational dissonance. The Portuguese system relies on the secrecy of justice. Evidence is guarded, and public leaks are illegal. The British system, driven by the intense media interest, favored public appeals and transparency. This led to a toxic relationship. The British press accused the Portuguese of incompetence, mocking their hours and their methods. In retaliation, Portuguese officials privately accused the British of interference and colonial arrogance. This friction had tangible consequences. Operation Grange, the massive review launched by the British Metropolitan Police years later, was funded by millions of pounds of taxpayer money. It was an unprecedented move, a foreign police force investigating a crime on sovereign Portuguese soil. While it was presented as a gesture of support, it was also a political necessity. The British government could not afford to be seen as abandoning a middle-class family with high media visibility. The funding of Operation Grange raises difficult questions about the hierarchy of vulnerability. Would millions be spent on a review for a missing child from a less privileged background? The answer, statistically, is no. The legal wall was thick. International letters of request. The formal method for one country to ask another for evidence took months to process. Translations were often inaccurate. Nuances were lost. A detective in Leicester might have a lead that required a witness statement from the Algarve, but the bureaucracy turned a simple phone call into a 6-month paper trail. The suspect could move, the evidence could degrade, and memories could fade while the paperwork sat on a desk. Furthermore, the moral wall prevented honest dialogue. The Portuguese police felt humiliated by the British review, which effectively told the world, "We do not trust your work." This defensiveness led to a hardening of positions. The Portuguese stuck to their accident theory, while the British team publicly committed to the abduction or stranger theory. Instead of pooling resources to solve a puzzle, the two forces were working on entirely different pictures. The investigation was also hampered by the media wall. Every leak, every briefing was weaponized. If the Portuguese police leaked a detail about the dogs, the British team would counter-leak a detail about a new sighting. The press became a proxy for the police fight. This environment is toxic to justice. Witnesses became afraid to come forward, fearing they would be devoured by the tabloids. The truth was not just hidden. It was buried under layers of national pride and political posturing. As we look back at this period of the case, we see a tragedy compounded by bureaucracy. The missing individual was somewhere out there, or her remains were hidden, but the people paid to find her were busy fighting over jurisdiction. The secure location of the courtroom was never reached because the evidence couldn't get past the border guards of national ego. The investigation had turned into a cold case, not because there were no leads, but because the system was too paralyzed to follow them. And in the distance, a new player was watching a German national with a yellow van, whose name was already in the files, unnoticed amidst the noise of the international quarrel. The investigation into the disappearance at the Ocean Club eventually reached a critical fracture point, not due to a lack of leads, but due to a collision between evidence and politics. In the autumn of that year, the man leading the inquiry, a seasoned coordinator of the judicial police, made a decision that would seal his professional fate. He decided to follow the evidence where it logically led, even though it pointed toward a hypothesis that the world and the diplomatic powers refused to accept. The coordinator had begun to publicly question the inconsistencies in the statements provided by the group of friends. He challenged the timeline of the night schedule. He looked at the lack of physical evidence for a forced entry, and most controversially, he authorized the hypothesis that the incident may have occurred inside the apartment rather than being the work of a stranger from the outside. In the world of high-stakes policing, this is known as crossing the blue line. It is the moment an officer stops protecting the reputation of the stakeholders and starts protecting the integrity of the file. The backlash was immediate and administrative. The coordinator was removed from the case. His removal was framed as a personnel change, but analysts viewed it as a decapitation of the investigation. The message sent to the rest of the force was clear. Do not pursue lines of inquiry that cause diplomatic embarrassment. This is a recurring theme in high-profile cases involving international relations. The legal wall becomes a tool of censorship when the lead detective was silenced. The accident theory effectively died with his career. We must pause to analyze the value of this moment for the audience. Why does the system remove effective investigators? It is often because the truth is less valuable than stability. The parents had the backing of their government and a powerful media machine. The detective had only his case file. In a battle between public relations and police procedure, Public relations almost always wins. Following his removal, the coordinator wrote a book detailing his theory. This publication was promptly banned, and a long legal battle ensued. This litigation served as a distraction, shifting the focus from the search for the missing daughter to a war over libel and reputation. The removal of the lead investigator created a vacuum of authority. The inquiry lost its direction. The remaining officers, fearing for their own careers, retreated into passivity. This is the chilling effect of bureaucracy. When you punish the messenger, you ensure that no one else will ever deliver the message. The investigation did not technically close, but the spirit of inquiry was extinguished. The theory of the stranger became the only acceptable narrative, not because it was proven, but because it was safe. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of fear. As the years rolled on, the fervor of the initial search faded into a dull, aching routine. The period following 2008 can be described as the long hiatus. The files in Portugal were archived, the arguido status of the parents was lifted, and the case was officially shelved. However, while the police work stopped, the industry of empathy continued to churn. During this time, private investigators were hired using the funds raised by the public. This phase of the saga is characterized by phantom leads. We saw the emergence of sketches of suspicious men, an individual with pockmarked skin, a man carrying a bundle, images that floated through the press but led nowhere. There were sightings reported in Morocco, in Spain, in Belgium. Each sighting generated a headline, a spike in hope, and then a quiet retraction. Analysts argue that this period was less about investigation and more about maintenance. The public needed to feel that something was happening, even if the result was zero. The ritual of remembrance became a fixed point in the calendar. Every year, on the anniversary of the vanishing, the media would reassemble. They would interview the parents, replay the same footage, and speculate on the same theories. This repetition serves a psychological function for society. It allows us to perform our compassion without having to confront the uncomfortable reality that we are no closer to the truth. The missing daughter became a ghost story, a cautionary tale told to remind the world that danger exists. However, we must look critically at the role of private investigation firms during this hiatus. Without the legal powers of the police, the power to arrest, to seize phone records, to secure warrants, private detectives are often powerless. They chased shadows. One famous firm claimed they were close to cracking the case, only to dissolve in scandal shortly after. This exposes the vulnerability of desperate families. When the state gives up, the market steps in, and the market is not always honest. The cold case status also allowed the moral wall to solidify. With no active police updates, the public was left with only their own theories. The internet became the new detective agency. Forums and social media groups dissected every pixel of the old photos. This did not help the case. It muddied the waters. The line between citizen journalism and harassment became blurred. The lack of official information created a breeding ground for misinformation. The tragedy had become a spectator sport, played out in the comments sections of the world. This hiatus teaches us that time does not heal all wounds. Sometimes it just infects them. The missing individual was no longer a person to be found, but a topic to be debated. The silence of the archives in Portugal stood in stark contrast to the noise of the internet. And in that noise, the actual evidence, the timeline, the biological traces, the phone data was slowly being forgotten, replaced by the legend of the one who was simply taken. In 2011, the narrative underwent a massive, artificial resurrection. This was not driven by new evidence found in a field, but by a decision made in an office in London, the British government. Under pressure from a powerful media campaign and the family's continued lobbying, ordered the Metropolitan Police to launch a review. This birthed Operation Grange, an inquiry that would become one of the most expensive missing person investigations in history. The establishment of Operation Grange was a unique event. It is rare for a national police force to investigate a crime that occurred in a foreign jurisdiction years after the fact. Critics argue that this was a political gesture, a way for the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister to show they cared about a middle-class tragedy. It reinforces the hierarchy of vulnerability. Would a similar task force, costing millions of pounds, be established for a missing person from a marginalized community? The answer reveals the unequal value we place on different lives. The operation began with a forensic review. The British detectives took every piece of paper, every statement, and every photo from the Portuguese files and re-examined them. They touted their superior technology and resources. The narrative they pushed was a return to the stranger theory. They released EFIT's computer-generated images of men seen in the area. These images were broadcast globally, reigniting the hunt. But seasoned observers noted a flaw. These sightings were years old. Human memory is fragile. After 4 or 5 years, it is almost useless. The clash of jurisdictions flared up again. The Portuguese authorities viewed Operation Grange as a violation of their sovereignty and a criticism of their initial work. While they publicly cooperated, privately, the flow of information was sluggish. The British team was working in a legal bubble, trying to solve a puzzle in a country where they had no power of arrest. They could identify a suspect, but they could not touch him without Portuguese permission. As the budget for Operation Grange swelled into the millions, the public began to ask questions about the return on investment. The operation ruled out the parents completely, stating there was no evidence to implicate them. This was a significant moment of exoneration for the family, but it was met with skepticism by those who remembered the initial Portuguese findings. The operation seemed determined to find a predator or an offender to fit the abduction narrative. Operation Grange represents the ultimate attempt to use money and resources to bend reality. It operated on the belief that if you spend enough, you will find the answer. But a crime scene that was contaminated years ago cannot be cleaned by a checkbook. The operation kept the brand alive. It kept the parents in the news, and it kept the hope of a resolution dangling before the public. But deep down, it was a performance of justice. It looked like action. It sounded like progress. But for years, it produced nothing but more paperwork. It was a testament to the power of influence, proof that, with the right connections, a case can be kept on life support indefinitely, long after the trail has gone cold. By the time the calendar turned to 2020, the investigation into the disappearance at the Ocean Club had transformed from an active police inquiry into a bureaucratic burden. The case had been open for 13 years. In the world of criminal justice, a file that remains open for this length of time without resolution becomes toxic. It drains resources, it damages the reputation of the agencies involved, and it serves as a constant, humiliating reminder of institutional failure. The British investigation, Operation Grange, was facing an existential crisis. It had consumed millions of pounds of public funding, a staggering amount that was drawing sharp criticism from taxpayers and rival political factions. Questions were being asked in Parliament. How long can a single investigation continue with 0 arrests? The hierarchy of vulnerability was being challenged by the sheer economics of the situation. There was a palpable sense that the funding was about to be cut. The authorities needed a result. If they could not provide a reunion, they needed to provide a resolution. They needed a villain. We must analyze the concept of investigative fatigue. When detectives work on a case for over a decade with no physical breakthroughs, the mindset shifts. The search for the truth, which is often messy, complex, and unsatisfying, is replaced by the search for a plausible conclusion. The system begins to crave an ending. In this context, the stranger theory is the most administratively convenient outcome. If the perpetrator is a transient, foreign individual with no ties to the establishment, it absolves everyone. It absolves the parents of negligence. It absolves the Portuguese police of their initial failure to secure the border, and it validates the millions spent by the British police on the abduction hypothesis. This period was defined by a specific kind of silence, the silence of anticipation. The media interest had waned, but the infrastructure of the empathy industry was still in place, waiting for a signal to reactivate. The public was tired of the ambiguity. Psychological studies show that human beings have a low tolerance for unresolved narratives. We prefer a dark certainty to an endless mystery. We want to know who did it, so we can categorize the event and move on. The authorities understood this. They knew that to close the file, they could not simply say, "We do not know." They had to offer a name. The moral wall surrounding the case had also hardened. The supporters of the family and the critics of the family had dug into their trenches. Any new evidence was viewed not objectively, but through the lens of confirmation bias. The environment was ripe for suspect substitution, the phenomenon where a new suspect is introduced who fits the public's imagination so perfectly that the lack of physical evidence is overlooked. The stage was set for a dramatic pivot. The system required a monster to take the fall, and in the files of the German federal police, a potential candidate had been waiting in the shadows for years. In June of 2020, the investigation detonated a media bombshell that reverberated around the globe. The German authorities, in coordination with British police, announced that they had identified a prime suspect. His name was Christian B. This announcement marked the beginning of the suspect substitution phase in earnest. Christian B. was not just a person of interest. He was presented as the living embodiment of the criminal archetype that the public had feared since the very first night. Christian B. fit the profile of the ideal villain with terrifying precision. He was a drifter who lived in a camper van, a vehicle that symbolizes transience and the ability to hide. He was a foreign national living on the fringes of the Algarve society. He had a documented history of serious offenses and burglary. He was known to possess a jagged, chaotic lifestyle that contrasted sharply with the ordered, middle-class world of the resort. To the public consuming the news, he looked the part. His mugshot, often featuring disheveled hair and a hard stare, was plastered across every screen. The visual narrative was complete before a single piece of evidence was tested in court. However, we must look closer at the evidence that accompanied this announcement. The authorities linked him to the area via mobile phone mass data. They could place his phone near the Ocean Club on the night of the vanishing. But phone location data is not the same as physical presence in a room. It proves proximity, not culpability. Furthermore, the confessions cited by prosecutors allegedly came from a conversation with a former associate, a source that defense attorneys argue is notoriously unreliable in criminal proceedings. There was no DNA linking him to the apartment. There was no forensic trace of the missing daughter in his van. The case was circumstantial, built on a timeline and a character profile rather than hard science. The reaction of the empathy industry was immediate and ferocious. The media convicted Christian B. within hours. Documentaries were commissioned exploring his past. His life was dissected. The narrative that emerged was one of the monster in our midst. This served a crucial function for the authorities. It reset the clock. The criticism regarding the wasted millions of pounds evaporated. The British police could claim justification. We were right to keep looking. The predator was there all along. The Portuguese police could quietly step back as the blame shifted to a German national. It was a diplomatic and public relations victory. But from an analytical perspective, the timing is suspicious. The announcement came just as the statute of limitations for other offenses was approaching in Germany, and just as the British funding was under threat. Was Christian B. the true perpetrator, or was he simply the most convenient subject available in the database? He was a man with a dark past, certainly, and a man capable of harm, but being a criminal does not automatically make one guilty of this specific crime. The emergence of Christian B. allowed the world to engage in a collective act of projection. We projected all our fears, our anger, and our need for justice onto this one individual. He became the container for the mystery. By focusing entirely on him, the questions about the initial investigation, the timeline of the parents, and the failures of the border control were silenced. The story had found its ending, or at least a version of an ending that the public was willing to buy. The complexity of the case was flattened into a simple binary: the innocent victim and the guilty drifter. It was a story that satisfied the emotional needs of the audience, even if the legal proof remained dangerously thin. The announcement that Christian B. was the prime suspect was delivered with the certainty of a verdict. Yet it lacked the foundation of a trial. In the weeks following the public revelation, the world waited for the smoking gun. We expected a forensic breakthrough, a match of biological traces, a piece of clothing found in the camper van, or a digital footprint linking the suspect directly to the missing daughter. Instead, what unfolded was a phenomenon legal analysts refer to as the theater of evidence. The German prosecutor made a startling claim: they had concrete evidence regarding the tragic fate of the individual. This statement was designed to shatter hope and force a conclusion. However, when pressed by defense attorneys and journalists for the specifics of this evidence, the narrative became opaque. It was revealed that there was no body, no DNA, and no photographic proof of the crime itself. The concrete evidence was, in reality, a series of logical inferences based on the suspect's past behavior and his proximity to the scene. In a court of law, inference is not proof. But in the court of public opinion, it is often enough to secure a conviction. We must scrutinize the pillars of the case against Christian B. The first pillar was the cell phone data. Investigators established that a mobile phone belonging to the suspect was connected to a mast in Praia da Luz on the night of the vanishing. While this places the device in the general vicinity, it does not place the man inside the apartment. Technical experts argue that cell tower triangulation in 2007 was imprecise, covering a radius that included miles of coastline, roads, and residential areas. The data proves he was in the town, a fact he had never denied, but it does not prove he was the one who opened the window. The second pillar was the confession. The prosecution relied heavily on the testimony of a former associate who claimed that Christian B. had made incriminating remarks while they were watching a news report about the case years later. Legal historians will tell you that jailhouse confessions or testimony from criminal associates are the most fragile form of evidence. They are easily motivated by revenge, reward, or a desire for leniency in their own cases. By basing a global accusation on hearsay, the investigation was walking on a razor's edge. This strategy, announcing guilt before proving it, is a tactic known as flushing the birds. The authorities hoped that by naming Christian B. and releasing photos of his van, they would panic him into making a mistake or encourage other witnesses to come forward. It was a gamble. They were using the media as an investigative tool. But this approach has a dark side. It effectively dismantled the presumption of innocence. For the public, the headline "Prosecutor believes suspect killed her" was indistinguishable from a jury verdict. The nuance was lost. We must also ask why this theater of evidence was necessary. Critics argue it was a distraction. By focusing the world's eyes on the yellow camper van and the monster inside it, the authorities diverted attention away from the glaring failures of the past. The lack of a sealed crime scene on the first night, the failure to secure the border, and the years of wasted funding on Operation Grange were all forgotten. Christian B. became the perfect shield for institutional incompetence. If he is the villain, then the police are the heroes who finally caught him. If he is not, then the investigation has spent years chasing another phantom while the truth remains buried. The theater of evidence relies on the audience's willingness to suspend disbelief. We wanted to believe the case was solved. We wanted to believe that the bad man had been found. And because of that desire, we accepted a narrative that, under strict legal scrutiny, was full of holes. The prosecution was not arguing to a judge. They were arguing to the crowd. And the crowd, exhausted by years of mystery, was ready to applaud any ending they were given. Behind the unified front of press conferences and official statements, the investigation was far from unanimous. In every major case that spans decades and borders, there are dissenting voices, investigators who read the files and see a different story. Policing is built on a rigid hierarchy. It is a system where loyalty to the chain of command is often valued higher than individual curiosity. We know from leaked reports and off-the-record interviews that there were detectives who viewed the Christian B theory with profound skepticism. They pointed out the lack of forensic links. They questioned why, if this man was so obviously guilty, he had been overlooked for 13 years despite being in the databases. But in modern law enforcement, to question the flagship theory is to risk one's career. This brings us to the concept of institutional omerta. It is an unwritten code of silence. When a high-profile investigation commits to a specific path, in this case, the stranger abduction theory supported by millions of pounds of funding, any evidence that contradicts that path becomes inconvenient. Officers who tried to pursue alternative leads, or who wanted to re-examine the inconsistencies in the original timeline, found themselves sidelined. They were reassigned to traffic duties, moved to different departments, or encouraged to retire. The system cleanses itself of doubt to maintain the appearance of certainty. We must look at the psychological toll on these silenced investigators. Imagine knowing that a case is being steered by politics rather than proof. Imagine seeing the public celebrate a breakthrough that you know is based on thin air. This creates a moral injury. We often think of corruption as money changing hands, but the most dangerous form of corruption is intellectual dishonesty, the refusal to look at facts that might embarrass the department. The blue line is not just about protecting officers from criminals. It is about protecting the reputation of the force from its own mistakes. The silence also extended to the legal teams. In Germany, the defense attorney for Christian B faced immense hostility. To defend the designated monster is to become a pariah. But the defense raised valid points that the media largely ignored. They highlighted that the suspect had no history of this specific type of offense. They pointed out that the timeline required him to be in 2 places at once. These arguments were drowned out by the noise of the empathy industry. The public did not want a fair trial. They wanted a witch hunt. We, the public, practice moral outsourcing. We trust the police to tell us the truth so that we do not have to do the hard work of critical thinking. When a whistleblower tries to speak up like the original Portuguese coordinator who was fired for questioning the parents, we often join the mob in condemning them. We prefer a comfortable lie to a difficult truth. The tragedy of the silenced is that they often hold the keys to the case. Buried in the rejected reports and the ignored memos are the leads that were never followed. The system decided that finding the missing daughter was less important than protecting the narrative, and so the dissenting officers stay quiet, waiting for the day when the political winds change and the truth is finally allowed to breathe. Until then, the investigation remains a monologue, spoken by those in power, while the whispers of doubt are kept behind closed doors. The lesson here is chilling. In the industry of silence, the truth is the first casualty. As we approach the end of this examination, we must turn the lens away from the suspects, the police, and the parents, and turn it toward the 4th player in this tragedy, the audience. For nearly 2 decades, the disappearance at the Ocean Club has been the most consumed missing person story in global history. It has generated billions of clicks, millions of newspaper sales, and countless hours of television programming. We must ask ourselves a difficult question. Why do we watch? Psychologists suggest that the public's obsession with this case is driven by a phenomenon known as vicarious trauma. We consume the pain of others from the safety of our living rooms. It allows us to feel deep emotion, fear, pity, outrage without any genuine risk to our own lives. The missing daughter became a vessel for our collective anxiety. She represents the ultimate fear of the modern era, that no matter how much money we spend on gated communities and secure locations, we cannot fully protect the ones we love. This case effectively launched the modern true crime genre. Before this event, crime reporting was largely the domain of evening news bulletins. After this, it became entertainment. We saw the rise of the armchair detective. Online forums exploded with thousands of users analyzing pixels in photographs, debating timelines, and accusing individuals they had never met. While this is often framed as awareness, analysts argue it is actually recreational judgment. The tragedy was gamified. The search for a human being was replaced by the thrill of solving a puzzle. This trivializes the loss. When justice becomes a spectator sport, the moral weight of the crime evaporates. The empathy industry is also an economic engine. Media outlets know that this specific face on a cover guarantees engagement. Documentaries promise new clues, but often deliver only recycled theories. This creates a perverse incentive. If the case were solved tomorrow, if the truth were final and unexciting, the industry would lose its most valuable asset. Therefore, the narrative is kept in a state of perpetual suspension. We are fed updates that change nothing, designed to keep the audience emotionally hooked but factually starving. We must also confront the concept of performative compassion. In the age of social media, sharing a photo of the missing individual became a way to signal virtue. It allowed people to say, "I am a good person because I care about this." But caring is not the same as acting. Real empathy requires asking hard questions about the system that failed. It requires demanding accountability from politicians and police chiefs. Instead, the public settled for sentimental solidarity. We lit virtual candles while the real investigation crumbled under the weight of incompetence and political interference. The paradox is this: the more we consumed the story, the further we drifted from the truth. The noise of the global conversation drowned out the quiet, subtle details that might have solved the case. We created a celebrity victim, and in doing so, we made it almost impossible for the police to work in the shadows where real detective work happens. The camera lights were too bright. They blinded the very people who were supposed to be looking for the clues. We did not help find her. We simply watched the show. We have walked through the timeline of the night, analyzed the failures of the initial response, and dissected the political battles between nations. We have seen how the legal wall, the media wall, and the moral wall rose up to block the path to justice. Now, we arrive at the conclusion. But in a case like this, there is no verdict, only a legacy. The story of the vanishing at the Ocean Club is not just about one missing individual. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when institutions value their reputation more than the truth. Throughout this investigation, we have returned to the metaphor of the candle. Imagine a flame representing the truth of what happened in that apartment. It is small, fragile, and easily obscured. For years, many hands have tried to cover this light. The hands of a police force afraid to admit mistakes. The hands of politicians afraid of diplomatic incidents. The hands of a media machine afraid of losing a profitable story. And perhaps the hands of a public afraid to face the darkness of human nature. But the physics of truth is simple. You can hide the light, but you cannot extinguish it as long as someone is willing to remember. The legacy of this case is profound. It changed the way the world parents. It ended the era of the free-range holiday. It instilled a permanent anxiety in a generation of families, teaching them that a secure location is a myth and that a predator can exist in the most beautiful of places. But it also left a legacy of skepticism. The public no longer blindly trusts the official statement. We have learned that police chiefs can be silenced, that files can be shelved, and that suspects can be manufactured to fit a political timeline. So, where does that leave us? The investigation into the German suspect, Christian B., remains open but contested. The concrete evidence has yet to materialize in a courtroom. The parents continue to wait, suspended in the amber of ambiguous loss. The case is technically active, yet practically frozen. But we must end on a note of moral demand. Justice is not a gift handed down by the state. It is a standard insisted upon by the people. As long as we accept closure narratives instead of factual proof, we allow the system to fail. We must be willing to sit with the discomfort of the unknown rather than accepting a convenient lie. We must reject the industry of empathy that sells us tragedy as entertainment. The missing daughter is no longer the figure in the poster. She would be an adult now, a person with a life unlived. To honor her is not to obsess over the mystery, but to demand a world where truth is not for sale. The candle is still burning behind the cupped hands of the powerful. It flickers in the files of the whistleblowers, in the doubts of the honest detectives, and in the memory of those who refuse to look away. Shadows may shift, and narratives may change, but the truth remains patient. It waits to be seen. And until the day the hands are removed and the light fills the room, the story is not over. It is simply waiting for the courage to be told.